You're listening to From Stillness, an audiobook for a mind in need of quiet. As children, many of us were told we were smart, and at the time, it felt like a gift. That praise gave us a sense of identity. We were the clever ones, the ones who solved problems quickly, got gold stars without trying, and seemed to glide effortlessly through the early years of school. But what we didn't realize was that this constant reinforcement wasn't praising effort, curiosity, or resilience. It was praising ease. We weren't taught to love learning or to embrace challenge. We were taught, subtly but consistently, that being smart meant things should feel easy. And that idea stuck. At first, it worked. Being the smart kid meant being ahead, getting noticed, and standing out. But slowly, it became something else. That label, smart, stopped being a reflection of how we approach the world and started becoming something we had to protect. Because if we were smart, then struggling with something must mean something was wrong. So we learned not to take risks. We avoided challenges where we couldn't guarantee success. We became cautious, not because we weren't curious, but because failure started to feel like a threat to who we were. And here lies the trap. When your identity is built around being smart, every obstacle feels personal. It's not just a problem to solve, it's evidence that maybe you're not who people think you are. So you play it safe. You stay in your lane. You only do what you're already good at. The world becomes smaller, not because you aren't capable, but because you're afraid of losing the one thing you've always believed made you valuable. And in that quiet shrinking, a deeper problem begins to grow. You stop evolving. Because growth requires vulnerability. And when being smart is your shield, vulnerability feels far too risky. When your sense of identity is built around always being the one who gets it right, who impresses with ease, it creates a subtle yet destructive fear, the fear of struggle. As a child, you were rewarded not for trying, but for succeeding effortlessly. That kind of praise wires the mind to avoid anything that threatens that image. So, when a situation arises where effort is needed, where you might fail, look clumsy, or not immediately excel, your instinct isn't to lean in and grow. It's to retreat. This is where the comfort zone quietly becomes a cage. You begin to choose safety over potential. You don't join the club unless you're sure you'll be great at it. You skip the audition because you might not be the best. You avoid group projects because they challenge your patience or communication skills. And without even noticing, you stop saying yes to life's messy, uncertain, growth-filled opportunities. You opt out of situations where real development happens: collaboration, experimentation, failure, and resilience, all because those things might expose a crack in your smart image. But the cost is high. While others build confidence through experience, you stagnate. While others deepen friendships through shared challenges, you drift further into isolation. Because connection doesn't come from being impressive, it comes from being involved. The awkward laughter, the shared setbacks, the sense of trying something new together, these are the building blocks of genuine relationships. But when you spend your life protecting an identity, instead of expanding it, you miss out on the very experiences that would make you feel alive, connected, and capable. In trying to be exceptional, you unintentionally keep yourself on the outside looking in, not because you don't belong, but because you were never taught how to let go and just participate. When you feel out of sync with others, like you're always watching connection happen instead of experiencing it, it's often because you've traded emotional presence for analytical control. Smart kids, growing into smart adults, are frequently praised for their ability to think, assess, and understand. So when they feel socially unsure, they try to solve relationships with logic. They analyze conversations like equations, predict outcomes, and rehearse dialogue in their minds. This develops what's known as cognitive empathy, the ability to understand what others feel without actually feeling it yourself. On the surface, this works. You can hold conversations, ask thoughtful questions, even seem emotionally aware. But it's all happening from a distance. Deep down, you're still standing on the outside, watching your social life through glass. That's because true connection isn't logical. It doesn't come from understanding emotions, it comes from experiencing them. From being present, from laughing without scripting the moment, from allowing yourself to be seen. even when you're unsure or awkward. But for someone whose self-worth has been built around always being composed and capable, showing up without a plan feels terrifying. So instead of risking rejection or failure in a social setting, you begin to avoid them. Over time, even small moments of interaction become draining, not because you dislike people, but because you're trying so hard to perform well that you never get to just be. And when socializing feels like performance, it stops being restorative. It becomes effort, not ease. And eventually, you tell yourself a story that you're different, more complex, less social, when really, you're just exhausted from the pressure to get connection right. Over time, the reliance on intellect to solve emotional discomfort creates an unexpected trap, one where every feeling becomes a problem to analyze rather than a signal to feel. For many who grew up praised for their intelligence, the instinct is always to figure it out. So when feelings of loneliness, insecurity, or disconnection arise, the first response isn't to sit with them, but to dissect them. You ask, "Why do I feel this way?" Or, "What's wrong with me?" As if there's a neat formula that can resolve emotional pain. But emotions don't follow logic. They aren't equations to be solved or puzzles to be completed. When you try to apply intelligence to fix your sense of self-worth, it just creates an endless loop of analysis that never leads to peace. You might journal endlessly, construct rational arguments about why you're fine, or rehearse positivity in your mind, but the ache remains. That's because self-worth isn't built through reasoning. It's built through experiences that reaffirm again and again that you're allowed to be human. When those experiences are missing, the mind compensates with performance. It creates a persona, someone confident, competent, detached. But inside, there's often an invisible fracture, a quiet desperation to feel okay without knowing how. And when the rational mind fails to soothe that wound, another defense forms: superiority. I just think differently, you tell yourself. I'm above small talk, above shallow relationships. Not because you truly believe it, but because it hurts less than admitting you feel left out. This is where defensive arrogance takes root, not as a sign of narcissism, but as protection against rejection. A shield, not a crown. Letting go of the smart kid identity isn't about rejecting your intelligence. It's about releasing the need to prove it constantly. When you build your self-worth around being seen as exceptional, you create a life ruled by fear, fear of effort, fear of failure, fear of being exposed as anything less than brilliant. And over time, this fear doesn't just limit your growth, it distorts your relationship with the world. You begin to avoid anything unfamiliar, anything challenging, anything that might dent the polished image you've spent years maintaining. But growth doesn't happen in the comfort of certainty. It happens in the awkward, uncomfortable, sometimes humiliating space of trying and failing and trying again. That's why the first real step forward is choosing a different identity, one centered on progress, not perfection. You stop asking, "What will make me look competent?" and start asking, "What will help me learn?" You allow yourself to do things badly. You give yourself permission to be a beginner again. And yes, it feels vulnerable at first. But this shift changes everything. Because now, you're no longer protecting an illusion, you're building a reality. A reality in which you are allowed to be human, allowed to be wrong, allowed to evolve. And in that space, you rediscover the joy of learning. Not because you're good at it, but because it moves you forward. And that's what truly matters. When emotional pain becomes too heavy to carry, the mind often builds walls to protect itself. For many smart kids turned adults, this protection shows up as quiet superiority, not because they genuinely believe they're better, but because it hurts less than admitting they feel left out. It becomes easier to say, "I just don't relate to most people," than to say, "I don't know how to connect anymore." And slowly, without intending to, they distance themselves even further from the very thing they crave: belonging. This defensive arrogance isn't rooted in pride, it's rooted in pain. It's a shield against rejection, a way to stay safe when vulnerability feels too dangerous. But the cruel irony is that the more you lean into this persona, the lonelier it gets. Because real connection doesn't happen behind walls. It happens in the open, through presence, humility, and the courage to be seen as you are, not as who you think you need to be. So healing begins with honesty. It begins with letting go of the narrative that you're different or above it all, and recognizing that the true strength lies in being human, in admitting you're unsure, in showing up messy, in saying, I don't have it all figured out either. Because when you drop the armor and step into the world as yourself, not the polished version, but the real one, that's when connection finally becomes possible. The path to healing begins when you let go of the need to be seen as the smart one. Not because intelligence is something to be ashamed of, but because when your entire sense of worth is tied to being effortlessly exceptional, growth becomes threatening. Every challenge feels like a risk to your identity, and so you avoid the very things that would help you evolve. But real growth doesn't happen in the echo chamber of success. It happens in the mess, in the awkward beginnings, in the moments when you dare to show up without a guarantee of excellence. To move forward, the focus must shift from proving to participating. You begin to ask not, how can I maintain the image of intelligence? But, what will help me grow? And that shift, from protecting your pride to embracing imperfection, changes everything. You let yourself try new things, even if you're terrible at them. You show up not to impress, but to engage. And slowly, you realize that failing doesn't make you less worthy. In fact, it's the very thing that makes you human. This isn't a step backward. It's your first real step toward becoming whole. The goal isn't to abandon your intelligence, but to stop making it the pedestal you stand on. Because once you're willing to be seen trying, not succeeding, just trying, you reconnect with the world in a way that's honest, humble, and deeply fulfilling. And from that place, real change becomes not only possible but inevitable. When the loneliness becomes too much to bear, a subtle shift happens in the mind of the once celebrated smart kid. Instead of confronting the pain of feeling left out or emotionally distant, a story forms, one that says, I'm just different from other people. This isn't a sign of superiority, it's a defense mechanism. Telling yourself that others are shallow or not on your level is easier than admitting that you don't know how to connect. It's a quiet, unspoken way of protecting yourself from the sting of rejection. This pattern is known as defensive arrogance, the belief that you're above others emotionally or intellectually, used as a shield against vulnerability. But here's the truth: this story, as comforting as it might seem, is the very thing keeping you isolated. Because connection doesn't happen from behind a wall. It happens in the awkward, uncertain moments of being real with others. It requires humility, presence, and a willingness to be seen, not as impressive, but as imperfect. The irony is, the very intelligence that once helped you stand out now works against you. You try to think your way into belonging, to analyze your way out of loneliness. But emotional pain doesn't respond to logic. It only softens when you stop trying to solve it and start allowing yourself to feel it. The way back to connection isn't about proving your depth or brilliance. It's about letting go of the idea that you have to be above others to be safe. Because real belonging only happens when you step down from the pedestal and into the shared human experience. And once you do, you'll realize you were never too different, just too guarded. The first and most essential step in healing from the smart kid trap is letting go of the identity itself. Not your intelligence, but the idea that your worth is tied to being the smartest person in the room. As a child, you may have built your self-esteem around the ease with which you understood things, around praise that came effortlessly. But as an adult, this attachment becomes a fragile structure. Every challenge feels like a threat. Every mistake feels like a collapse. And you begin to avoid the very experiences that would help you grow, all in the name of protecting the illusion of being exceptional. What needs to happen is a shift, away from an identity rooted in perceived ability and toward one grounded in growth. You must stop asking, will this make me look smart? And start asking, will this help me grow? Instead of staying in the safety of what you already know, you lean into discomfort. You let yourself try, mess up, learn. You show up, not to prove, but to participate. This is where real confidence is born, not from performance, but from presence. From learning to be okay with not knowing. From valuing effort over outcome. This isn't a downgrade, it's a rebirth. Because when you release the need to constantly impress, you gain something far more valuable: freedom. Freedom to be curious. Freedom to be imperfect. freedom to evolve without shame. And that's the kind of identity worth building, one that grows with you, not one you have to protect. One of the most profound lessons hidden in the experience of being a smart kid is this: true connection requires vulnerability, not perfection. Many high-achieving children grow up equating their value with performance. They fear failure, not just because it's uncomfortable, but because it threatens the identity they were praised for. Over time, this fear becomes a wall, a polished, high-achieving mask that hides deep loneliness. The tragedy is that this wall doesn't just keep others out. It traps you inside. You become the observer of life, not the participant. You analyze rather than engage. You impress rather than connect. But relationships, real, nourishing ones, aren't built through impressing. They're built through shared experience, through awkwardness, through being seen in your imperfect human state. So here's the shift. Instead of striving to be understood as extraordinary, learn to be fully present as ordinary. Let yourself be uncertain. Join the conversation even when you don't have the perfect thing to say. Try the thing you might be bad at. Connection happens not when we've perfected our image, but when we allow that image to soften. In practice, this means showing up honestly. It means letting go of the need to be above it all and learning to be with it all, the mess, the discomfort, the moments you don't quite get right. Because only when we release the armor of our old identity can we step into the kind of life where connection, growth, and authenticity are finally possible.